Have you ever noticed how some of the most confident voices in politics collapse the moment real facts enter the room? That's exactly what happened when Chuck Schumer tried to confront Kash Patel live. At first, Schumer came out strong, attacking Patel with the kind of certainty that usually leaves opponents scrambling. But what followed was something Schumer clearly did not expect. Instead of backing down, Patel responded with calm precision, point after point, fact after fact, and within minutes, the exchange flipped completely on its head. This wasn't just another heated argument on Capitol Hill. It was a moment where style met substance and substance won. The tension in the chamber was clear, every sentence carrying more weight than the last, and for viewers at home, it felt like watching a political heavyweight match, except this time the underdog came armed with something Schumer couldn't match: hard evidence. What made the clash so remarkable wasn't just Patel's composure under pressure, but the way he turned the attack into an opportunity. Instead of reacting emotionally, he walked Schumer and the audience through the facts, step by step, dismantling claims with clarity that couldn't be brushed aside. Viewers could sense the balance of power shifting in real time, and by the end of the opening moments, the momentum was firmly in Patel's hands. Now, here's why this matters. Political debates often turn into shouting matches where the loudest voice dominates. But in this case, the dynamic flipped. Patel didn't need volume. He used facts like sharp tools, cutting through confusion and forcing Schumer onto the defensive. And in a world where information is often spun or manipulated, seeing a figure hold the line with evidence carried a power that resonated far beyond the chamber walls. The hook of this story is not just that Patel survived an attack, it's that he turned the attack into a defining moment. The clash wasn't about winning a single exchange. It was about exposing how fragile rhetoric becomes when it's confronted by truth. And for the audience, this wasn't just political theater. It was a reminder that facts still matter, that preparation outshines performance, and that integrity has a way of breaking through noise. By the time the first act of this confrontation ended, one thing was clear. The man who walked into the room expecting to dominate the conversation was no longer in control. Schumer had launched the attack, but Patel had seized the stage, and everyone watching knew they were witnessing more than an argument. They were witnessing a turning point. That's where this story begins. To really understand why this clash between Chuck Schumer and Kash Patel became so explosive, we need to step back and look at the history that brought them to this moment, because it wasn't just about two men trading words on live television. It was the culmination of years of tension layered with issues of transparency, accountability, and how information is used in politics. Without this context, the exchange would seem like just another argument in Washington. With it, the full weight of what happened comes into focus. Kash Patel first entered the national spotlight during his time as a senior official involved in intelligence and defense matters. Known for his sharp attention to detail and ability to simplify complex investigations, Patel developed a reputation as someone who valued facts over theatrics. Whether people agreed with him or not, his approach was consistent. He wanted evidence on the table and he wanted the record to be clear. That consistency built trust among supporters who felt exhausted by spin and half truths. On the other hand, Chuck Schumer has been a dominant figure in American politics for decades. As Senate Majority Leader, his voice carries weight across party lines. He has built a career on strategy, influence, and the ability to frame issues in ways that resonate with both lawmakers and the public. But with that influence comes scrutiny and moments when his confidence has been tested. When their paths crossed, it wasn't random. Patel had been vocal about problems and how intelligence was handled and how political leaders shaped narratives for public consumption. Schumer, protective of his position and his party, often positioned himself as the defender of those narratives. The collision course was almost inevitable. The specific moment we're focusing on grew out of a broader dispute about how facts were being presented to the American people. Patel had raised concerns that important information was being selectively released, framed in ways that supported political agendas rather than giving citizens the full picture. Schumer, confident in his authority, saw this as an opportunity to challenge Patel publicly, perhaps thinking that Patel would stumble under pressure. What followed, as we saw in the opening act, was the exact opposite. But here's why this matters beyond the personalities. At its core, the clash symbolized something bigger, the battle between performance politics and fact based accountability. Viewers at home weren't just watching two men disagree, they were watching two very different approaches to leadership collide, one built on political maneuvering, the other on detailed records and timelines. The stakes were high because the issues being debated weren't minor. They touched on national security, the integrity of institutions, and the trust between government and the public. When Patel laid out his points, he wasn't just defending himself. He was challenging the way information had been shaped and presented at the highest levels. That's why Schumer's attack carried so much weight and why Patel's calm response struck such a chord. For ordinary citizens, this confrontation mattered because it echoed frustrations they had felt for years. People are tired of feeling like truth is filtered, delayed, or distorted. They're tired of political theater overshadowing genuine accountability. And when Patel pushed back with evidence, it felt like a rare moment where clarity cut through the fog. This background helps us see the confrontation as more than a single dramatic exchange. It was the visible tip of a much deeper struggle over how the system works and who it serves. If Schumer represented the established guard of political strategy, Patel represented the insistence that facts should not be twisted for convenience. That clash of philosophies is what gave this moment its intensity and why the fallout carried so much impact. By laying out the context, we can better appreciate the unfolding story. This wasn't just about a senator and a former official trading barbs. It was about whether leaders would be held accountable to the truth and whether the public would finally see facts unfiltered. That's why the stage was so tense and why Patel's every word landed with such force. As the curtain lifted on the scandal itself, viewers weren't just leaning in because of the personalities involved. They were leaning in because they sensed that something bigger was on the line. And as we move into the next act where the scandal breaks wide open, we see exactly how that pressure built into a confrontation that no one could ignore. The moment that truly set everything in motion began with a challenge live, an unfiltered Chuck Schumer, confident in his stature and years of political experience, believed he could corner Kash Patel with pointed accusations and force him into retreat. The setting was tense, the cameras were rolling, and every word mattered. What Schumer may not have anticipated was that Patel came prepared not with loud rhetoric, but with a steady stack of facts, each layered to dismantle the senator's claims one by one. The exchange started sharply. Schumer's opening remarks carried the weight of authority, but they also carried an assumption that Patel would be caught off guard, defense. I've maybe even intimidated by the majority leader's presence. Instead, Patel kept his tone measured. He let Schumer speak, listening intently as if waiting for the right moment to turn the conversation upside down. The contrast was striking. On one side, a seasoned politician wielding influence like a weapon. On the other, a former official leaning on records, dates, and evidence that had been meticulously compiled. When Patel responded, the energy in the room shifted. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't reach for dramatic flourishes. He simply began laying out the timeline, connecting actions with consequences, and grounding his words in documented fact. Each point he made cut through the noise, not because it was loud, but because it was undeniable. For the audience watching this wasn't just a rebuttal, it was a reversal of expectations. The man who was supposed to be on the defensive suddenly looked like the one in control. Schumer tried to interrupt a tactic he had used successfully in countless debates, but Patel remained steady. He returned to the evidence, clarifying details, making the picture clearer with each sentence. The audience could see the frustration building on Schumer's face as Patel refused to be thrown off balance. What became apparent and what made this moment so compelling was that Patel wasn't improvising. He wasn't searching for words. He had come armed with information that matched Schumer's attack step for step. The turning point came when Patel connected Schumer's own statements to the broader issue of selective framing. Instead of reacting emotionally, Patel walked the audience through what had been said before, compared it with verifiable records, and asked a simple question: why were certain details left out? That question cut deeper than any accusation. It forced the room to pause because it wasn't just aimed at Schumer, it was aimed at the way politics often works. The implication was clear: if facts were being bent to fit a narrative, then the real issue wasn't Patel's credibility. The real issue was whether the truth was being hidden. The room grew quieter as Patel continued because each example built on the last. The debate stopped feeling like a clash of personalities and started feeling like a courtroom, with Patel calmly presenting evidence and Schumer struggling to poke holes in it. For the viewers, this was the moment when the scandal broke open. The assumption that Patel would falter collapsed in real time, replaced by the reality that Schumer was the one being cornered by facts. It wasn't only what Patel said, but how he said it. His tone was plain-spoken, free of jargon, and accessible to anyone watching. He made complicated processes understandable. He turned abstract accusations into straightforward cause and effect, and by doing so, he invited the audience to judge for themselves. This approach was powerful because it removed the shield of political interpretation. It wasn't about what one side claimed versus the other. It was about documents, dates, and decisions that either lined up or didn't. The reactions in the room told the story. Supporters of Schumer, who had entered the exchange with confidence, shifted uneasily in their seats. Meanwhile, those who favored Patel leaned in, energized by how clearly he was presenting his case. Reporters in the press gallery typed furiously, sensing that the narrative of the day had just changed. Viewers at home, many of whom had grown used to political shouting matches, were struck by the calm precision of Patel's delivery. Schumer attempted to regain control by doubling down, framing Patel's evidence as misinterpretation or spin, but that tactic faltered because Patel anticipated it. Each time Schumer tried to dismiss a point, Patel simply produced another piece of information that backed up his position. The effect was cumulative. The more Schumer argued, the more Patel's evidence stood out as solid and unshakable. What made this moment his Torek wasn't just that Schumer's attack failed, it was that the attack backfired so dramatically. By underestimating Patel, Schumer had created the stage for him to shine. What was meant to be a takedown became a turning point where the supposed underdog dismantled the majority leader's arguments with patience and precision. For the public, the scandal wasn't that Patel had been attacked. The scandal was that the attack revealed deeper inconsistencies in how information was being presented at the highest levels. From this point forward, the narrative was no longer in Schumer's control. Patel's fact-driven style had seized the momentum, and it was clear to everyone watching that this wasn't just a political skirmish. It was the opening act of a much larger exposure. By the time the exchange wrapped, Schumer looked defensive while Patel looked resolute, and as viewers processed what they had just seen, the question on their minds was simple. If Patel had this much evidence ready at hand, what else was waiting to be uncovered? That's why this moment is remembered as the true breaking point. It wasn't about who shouted louder or who delivered the sharper insult. It was about who had the weight of truth behind them. In this case, Patel's steady reliance on facts overpowered Schumer's reliance on position and presence. The scandal had broken, not because someone claimed it, but because it was demonstrated in real time live before the nation. What began as a sharp exchange between Chuck Schumer and Kash Patel quickly evolved into something much larger. The early clash had already shifted the momentum in Patel's favor, but it was only the beginning. What followed was a steady, methodical escalation of evidence, each revelation layered on top of the last, building a picture too detailed and too consistent to dismiss. It wasn't just about winning a debate anymore. It was about uncovering truths that had been hidden beneath layers of political noise. Patel didn't rush. He understood that the strongest arguments are often built slowly, piece by piece. He began with the foundation, revisiting the accusations that had been thrown at him. Instead of countering them with emotion, he calmly produced documents, records, and timelines. Each detail was presented not as a defense, but as a connection to something larger. Viewers watching could feel the strategy at work. Patel wasn't just answering questions, he was pulling back a curtain. The first layer of evidence was simple but powerful. Patel highlighted how Schumer's claims had relied on partial information, leaving out key dates and context that dramatically changed the meaning. By restoring those missing details, Patel showed the audience that what had been painted as damning was in fact incomplete. It was a subtle but crucial move. Once people saw that one claim had cracks, they began questioning the rest. The seed of doubt had been planted not about Patel, but about the narrative that was being used against him. From there, Patel raised the stakes. He introduced financial records, correspondence, and internal memos, each one reinforcing his case. What made this presentation effective was that it didn't feel like a dump of information. Patel wove the details into a story, explaining why each document mattered, how it fit into the bigger picture, and what it revealed about the accusations at hand. The audience wasn't just hearing facts. They were following a narrative that made sense. The complexity of politics was suddenly made accessible. Schumer, recognizing the danger of losing control, tried to interject. But every attempt to reframe the discussion was met with another piece of evidence, another clear explanation that cut through the noise. Patel's methodical style turned the interruptions into opportunities because each one gave him a reason to bring out another detail. What began as an argument was turning into a sequence of revelations, with Patel holding the room's attention at every turn. The second layer of evidence reached deeper. Patel moved on documents and into testimony referencing statements from officials and experts who had firsthand knowledge of the issues being debated. This was a critical shift because it showed that the facts didn't stand alone. They were supported by credible voices, people who had seen the same patterns, the same inconsistencies, and were willing to put their names behind the truth. Suddenly, it wasn't just Patel saying it. It was a network of verification. The weight of this evidence began to show in the reactions around the chamber. Reporters who had entered the hearing expecting a straightforward clash now found themselves scribbling frantically, trying to keep up with the details being unveiled. Staffers whispered nervously, exchanging glances as they realized how deeply the case was being built. And Schumer, who had begun the exchange with commanding confidence, now found himself forced to respond to specifics rather than relying on broad statements. Patel pressed further. He presented a timeline that stretched across months, carefully aligning events, decisions, and outcomes. This wasn't just about pointing out a few mistakes. It was about demonstrating a pattern, a repeated set of choices and omissions that couldn't be explained away as coincidence. The power of a timeline is that it forces accountability. When actions and consequences are laid side by side, the narrative becomes harder to distort. And in this case, the pattern Patel revealed raised questions that went far beyond his own defense. The escalation didn't stop there. Patel introduced what could only be described as the third layer of evidence material that connected the dots between political statements and real-world outcomes. This was where the stakes grew even higher because it suggested that what was at play wasn't just political theater, but actual influence on policy and decisions that affected ordinary people. Patel explained how certain narratives, if left unchecked, could distort the truth in ways that directly shaped governance. And by grounding the argument in outcomes, he made it clear that this wasn't about abstract debates, it was about consequences that reached into everyday lives. The atmosphere grew heavier as Patel's evidence piled up. Each new revelation added weight to the previous one, building a sense of inevitability. For viewers, it felt like watching a structure being dismantled brick by brick. At first, Schumer's attack had seemed strong, but now it looked fragile, unable to withstand the steady pressure of documented fact. By this stage, even those who had entered skeptical of Patel were forced to acknowledge that his case was not only strong but unshakable. The escalation reached its peak when Patel unveiled a set of communications that directly contradicted Schumer's central narrative. This wasn't a matter of interpretation, it was black and white. Statements that had been made publicly were shown to be inconsistent with what had been acknowledged privately. That gap, once exposed, shattered the last defense Schumer had. It was no longer a debate about what Patel had done or said. It was now about the credibility of the attack itself. Schumer, visibly frustrated, attempted one last push to reframe the issue, but the damage was done. Patel's careful layering of evidence had not only defended his position, but turned the tables entirely. The senator who had entered the room expecting to dominate the exchange now looked cornered, while Patel stood steady, his credibility strengthened by the very attack meant to weaken it. For the public, this escalation was more than just a dramatic hearing. It was a lesson in how truth can prevail when presented with clarity and patience. In a political environment often dominated by sound bites and spin, Patel's methodical approach stood out. It showed that when facts are given space to breathe, they can cut through even the most aggressive attacks. And yet, the most important aspect of this escalation wasn't just the facts themselves. It was the way they were presented. Patel's style made the evidence accessible. He didn't overwhelm the audience with jargon or drown them in data. He walked them through it step by step, giving context, drawing connections, and explaining why it mattered. That clarity was what turned information into persuasion and persuasion into conviction. By the end of this section of the exchange, the outcome was clear. Patel had not only defended himself, but exposed cracks in the very foundation of Schumer's argument. The escalation of evidence had transformed the hearing from a political attack into a revelation of deeper issues. And for those watching, the question was no longer whether Patel had survived the exchange. The question was what else might come to light if this kind of scrutiny continued. What began as an attempt to put Patel on the defensive had backfired spectacularly. Instead of folding under pressure, he had used the attack as a stage to reveal truths that demanded attention. The escalation of evidence had changed the story, turning what was meant to be a takedown into a powerful demonstration of the strength of facts. And as Patel closed this chapter of the exchange, one thing was undeniable: the ground had shifted. What had started as a confrontation was now something much bigger. The evidence was building, the cracks were widening, and the system itself was beginning to look vulnerable. By the time Kash Patel had finished layering the evidence, the atmosphere was already tense. The initial clash with Chuck Schumer had shifted dramatically, but what came next was even more powerful. It was no longer about a single debate or a handful of accusations. Patel was about to expand the focus, pulling the curtain back on something much larger. This wasn't just a defense against political attacks. It was an exposure of how the system itself was operating and why that mattered to everyone watching. Patel understood that one scandal on its own might fade from the headlines, but when connected to a larger pattern, it revealed a deeper truth. So instead, of stopping at proving his point, he took the conversation further. He explained how the very methods used against him, selective framing, missing context, half truths dressed up as certainty, weren't unique to this one moment. They were part of a wider system of influence shaping the way information reached the public. The shift in tone was unmistakable. Patel's words carried more weight now, less about himself and more about the structure that allowed these narratives to thrive. He began showing how the same tactics had been used in other high profile cases, how facts had been bent and reshaped to fit predetermined conclusions, and how those distortions trickled down into decisions that affected ordinary citizens. What had started as a battle between two men was quickly turning into a mirror reflecting the state of governance itself. The first revelation was that the political system often rewarded the very behavior that Patel had just exposed. Those who controlled narratives, those who could spin half the story with confidence, often gained influence. Meanwhile, those who tried to slow things down and bring facts to the table risked being drowned out by louder voices. Patel highlighted this imbalance with examples drawn from recent history, connecting the dots in a way that made it impossible to ignore. The audience leaned in because this wasn't abstract theory. It was real, and Patel was making it clear. He pointed out how selective reporting shaped public opinion, how investigations stalled when they threatened powerful figures, and how accountability seemed to apply only when it was politically convenient. For many viewers, this was the first time someone had explained step by step how the gears of the system worked behind the scenes. What made the moment powerful was Patel's tone. He didn't sound bitter. He didn't frame himself as a victim. Instead, he spoke as someone who had seen the inside of the system and was determined to let the public understand it too. His delivery was calm, almost teaching, breaking down complex dynamics into plain language. That clarity created trust, and trust was the foundation for everything that followed. As Patel spoke, the implications grew heavier. If what he was describing was true, then it wasn't just about Chuck Schumer or one political fight. It was about a pattern of behavior that stretched across parties, across administrations, and across time. This wasn't about left or right. It was about how power protected itself. That realization hit hard because it reframed the entire exchange. Viewers who may have tuned in expecting a partisan clash suddenly realized they were witnessing something bigger, a rare moment when someone pulled back the curtain on how things really worked. Patel illustrated how systemic issues created real-world consequences. He explained how decisions made under the weight of distorted narratives affected national security funding priorities, and even how information was shared with the public. He made the stakes clear. If the system remained unchecked, the cycle would repeat, leaving citizens misinformed and leaders unaccountable. It wasn't just theory, it was cause and effect that touched the lives of ordinary people. This was where Patel's approach stood out most. He didn't just present the flaws, he connected them to the audience's daily experience. He explained why rising frustration with politics wasn't just a matter of personality clashes on television. It was a reflection of deeper structures that rewarded spin over substance. In doing so, Patel made the issue relatable. He turned systemic corruption from an abstract concern into something personal, something that mattered to the viewer sitting at home. As the weight of his words sank in, the silence in the chamber grew noticeable. Even those who had been vocal earlier now listened more carefully. Patel wasn't pointing fingers randomly. He was building a map showing how decisions made behind closed doors shaped the world outside them. And the more he spoke, the clearer it became that this wasn't just his story, it was everyone's story. Schumer, who had once been the commanding voice in the room, now struggled to regain footing. He tried to pivot, suggesting that Patel was exaggerating the scope of the issue. But Patel countered with yet more detail, not in a flood, but in a measured flow. Each example was clear, specific, and tied back to the central theme that the system itself, not just individuals, was creating these outcomes. The turning point in this section came when Patel made the stakes explicit. He explained that if accountability remained selective, then trust in institutions would continue to erode. And without trust, governance itself became fragile. That statement landed hard. It was no longer about a single hearing or a single clash. It was about the future of how the country functioned. The audience could sense that this was more than just a political performance. It was an unveiling of uncomfortable truths. And that's why the message resonated. Patel wasn't telling people what to think, he was showing them how the system worked and letting them draw their own conclusions. That style of delivery, plain spoken and fact driven, gave his words a weight that no amount of shouting could match. By the end of this section, the impact was undeniable. The scandal had grown from an attack against one man into a broader exposure of the mechanisms that shape power. Viewers were left not only questioning Schumer's attack, but questioning the very system that allowed such attacks to gain traction in the first place. The system had been exposed not with anger or noise, but with facts, patterns, and explanations that made the complex simple and once seen, it could not be unseen. Patel had shifted the conversation from defense to revelation, from being the target of an attack to being the one who revealed the deeper story. The chamber felt different now. What began as a heated clash had transformed into a sobering lesson. The evidence wasn't just about Patel anymore. It was about how the entire structure operated and whether that structure could be trusted. For the viewers, the question had changed. It wasn't simply whether Patel was right or wrong. It was whether the system itself could still serve the people it was meant to represent. And that question hung in the air, waiting to be answered. The moment everyone had been waiting for finally arrived. After hours of back and forth, after the evidence had been laid down, piece by piece, the debate reached its peak. This was the turning point where the tension that had been building boiled over, and the outcome of the confrontation became unmistakably clear. Chuck Schumer had entered the exchange confident, sharp, and ready to attack, but by now that confidence was slipping. Kash Patel, calm and steady from the start, was no longer just defending himself. He was steering the entire conversation, and everyone watching could feel the shift. The climax began with one of Schumer's sharpest attempts to regain control. He raised his voice, framing Patel's points as selective, accusing him of exaggeration, and questioning whether the so-called evidence could really prove anything beyond speculation. It was the kind of move that had worked for Schumer many times before: put doubt on the table, raise the emotional temperature, and watch the opponent stumble. But this time Patel didn't stumble. He leaned into the attack, and with measured precision, he responded not with emotion, but with more clarity than ever before. Patel calmly reminded the chamber that the documents, timelines, and records he presented weren't his opinions. They weren't theories pulled out of thin air, and then instead of stopping there, he went further. He showed how those facts connected to Schumer's own narrative, turning this senator's words into a trap of his own making. It was the kind of reversal that changes the tone of a debate instantly. The audience at home could feel it. The chamber itself could feel it. Patel wasn't just holding his ground anymore. He was pressing forward. Every sentence felt like it carried weight, cutting through the noise with a directness that made it impossible to ignore. Schumer, who had dominated countless debates before, was visibly on the defensive. This was the breaking point. For months, stories had circulated about Patel being underestimated, about his opponents dismissing him as someone who could be easily cornered. But here, live and unfiltered, he dismantled that assumption in front of millions. With each clear statement, he forced Schumer into a corner, not by raising his own voice, but by letting the facts speak louder than rhetoric ever could. What made this moment unforgettable was the simplicity of Patel's delivery. He didn't resort to grand gestures or theatrical outrage. Instead, he kept his tone even, his sentences sharp, and his language grounded in everyday terms. He explained why each fact mattered, why each piece of evidence fit into a larger pattern, and why ignoring them would come at a cost to the public. That approach gave the climax its power. It wasn't about spectacle, it was about undeniable truth cutting through the noise. Schumer tried again to push back, shifting to broader claims about political motivations and bias. But the more he tried, the more obvious it became that the ground was slipping beneath him. Patel didn't need to match Schumer's energy. He simply stayed steady, answering each point with precision and redirecting the conversation back to the core issue evidence. The contrast between them couldn't have been clearer. On one side, emotion and deflection; on the other, composure and facts. The audience reaction mirrored the shift in the chamber. People who may have tuned in expecting Patel to fold were now glued to the screen, realizing they were witnessing a moment where power changed hands in real time. Social media buzzed as clips circulated, each showing Patel's unflinching replies and Schumer's visible frustration. In a political landscape where perception often matters as much as reality, Patel had achieved both. He had the facts on his side, and now he had the perception of strength, too. The defining moment of the climax came when Patel laid down a single line that summed up the entire exchange. Looking directly at Schumer, he said, "When the facts are on the table, there's nowhere left to hide." The words weren't shouted. They weren't dressed in complicated language. They were plain, direct, and final. The chamber fell silent. For a brief moment, even Schumer had nothing to say, and in that silence the balance of power was sealed. That statement didn't just end an argument, it marked a turning point in Patel's role in the broader debate. He was no longer just responding to attacks. He had established himself as the figure leading the conversation, setting the terms and defining the stakes. The climax wasn't about a single win in a debate. It was about shifting the perception of who truly held the weight of credibility. The effect spread beyond the chamber. News outlets replayed the moment on loop. Commentators, even those critical of Patel, admitted the exchange had gone decisively in his favor. Viewers at home, many of whom had grown tired of politics, as usual, saw in Patel something rare: composure under fire, a refusal to bend to pressure, and a clear insistence on facts above spin. That combination turned a political clash into a cultural moment. The turning point also carried a deeper message. It showed that in a time when arguments often collapse into noise, patience and preparation could still prevail. Patel didn't need to outshout his opponent. He needed only to outlast him with truth. And in doing so, he reminded people watching that credibility isn't about who talks the loudest, it's about who brings evidence that can't be ignored. By the end of this act, Schumer's attempts to regain control had failed. The debate had shifted from his attack to Patel's defense, and finally to Patel's command of the room. The climax had been reached, and there was no turning back. The narrative was no longer in Schumer's hands. It belonged to Patel, and the audience knew it. As the session moved forward, one thought lingered in the air. The man who had been underestimated had just redefined the conversation, not with theatrics, but with facts delivered so plainly that even silence became a victory. That was the turning point. When the dust began to settle after the climax, it was clear the story couldn't just end with a dramatic exchange. The confrontation between Chuck Schumer and Kash Patel had opened a door, and what lay on the other side wasn't just a victory in debate, but a call for change. Patel's steady dismantling of rhetoric with facts didn't only expose the flaws. In one argument, it revealed weaknesses in the system itself. And now came the question everyone was waiting for: what happens next? Patel understood that an argument, no matter how strong, loses its power if it doesn't lead to something greater. So instead of stopping at the victory, he began shifting the conversation toward accountability and reform. He reminded the chamber and the millions watching at home that the real measure of success wasn't proving one man wrong. It was whether the truth could inspire structural change. The transition from confrontation to resolution was deliberate. Patel explained that the public deserved more than just entertainment from political clashes, they deserved results. He began laying out ideas that were straightforward solutions that ordinary citizens could understand, and reforms that directly tied back to the evidence he had just presented. In doing so, he turned the debate into a roadmap. The first step he emphasized was transparency. Without it, he explained, trust in institutions would remain fractured. He outlined the need for clearer disclosures, stronger oversight, and consistent reporting that wouldn't vanish into selective narratives. His point was simple: if information could be hidden, distorted, or buried, when it became inconvenient, then the cycle of mistrust would never break. The second step focused on accountability. Patel argued that accountability shouldn't be partisan, shouldn't be selective, and shouldn't depend on which side of the aisle someone stood. He framed it in terms that resonated with viewers. If an ordinary citizen faced consequences for bending the truth, then public officials should face even greater consequences when they did the same. The logic was direct, and it struck a chord because it carried no partisan spin, only a basic sense of fairness. The third step was reform itself, the changes needed to stop these problems from repeating. Patel spoke about strengthening oversight mechanisms, empowering independent bodies to investigate without interference, and ensuring that no matter how powerful a figure might be, the rules applied equally. His tone wasn't combative anymore. It was constructive, almost optimistic. The battle had been fought, and now it was time to build. This shift in tone was critical. Viewers who had spent the earlier parts of the exchange on edge, watching the clash unfold, now found themselves leaning into the vision of what could come next. Patel's calm, practical outline of reforms gave people something to hold on to beyond the spectacle. He didn't frame it as his personal victory. Instead, he made it about the public, about the viewers who had a right to demand a government that worked for them. The resolution also carried an emotional weight. Patel reminded everyone why this mattered. It wasn't about scoring political points or making headlines. It was as about ensuring that the truth didn't get buried under noise, that integrity didn't get sidelined by spin, and that citizens could trust the people elected to serve them. His words struck home because they weren't abstract. They connected to the frustration so many felt when watching politics play out in endless cycles of conflict with little result. By framing the resolution around reform, Patel elevated the moment from a debate to a movement. The public, energized by what they had seen, began rallying around the message. For many, it was refreshing to hear someone not just tear down an argument, but build something in its place. That's what made the resolution powerful. It wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of a call for change. Even Schumer, though unwilling to admit defeat, had little ground left to stand on. The conversation had moved past him while he tried to reframe the exchange as political theater. Patel had shifted the narrative toward constructive change, and in doing so, left Schumer on the outside looking in. The chamber, once divided by tension, now seemed more unified around the need for action. The reform message Patel delivered resonated beyond Washington news cycles, carried not just the clash but the solutions. Commentators noted that while fiery debates often fade, Patel's focus on outcomes kept the story alive. Grassroots discussions grew with people demanding reforms that mirrored his vision. Social media trended with hashtags calling for integrity and transparency, showing that the story had transformed from a single debate into a broader movement. The resolution's greatest strength was its clarity. Patel didn't drown his points in jargon or overcomplicated policy language. He spoke plainly, making reforms understandable to anyone listening. That accessibility ensured the message spread far beyond the walls of the chamber. Ordinary citizens, not just policy experts, could connect with the call for change, and in that accessibility lay the true potential for impact. By the close of this act, Patel had done something few manage in politics. He had taken an attack, turned it into a defense, transformed it into an exposure of the system, and finally reshaped it into a vision for reform. That progression gave the story its arc from confrontation to resolution, from tension to empowerment. The chamber that had once echoed with arguments now held something different, a sense of direction. And for the audience at home, the resolution felt like more than just the end of a chapter. It felt like an invitation to stay engaged, to demand accountability, and to push for the reforms Patel had laid out so clearly. This wasn't just the conclusion of a heated exchange. It was the beginning of something larger. The fight for reform had been set in motion, and there was no turning back. As the story reaches its conclusion, the lessons stand out clearly. What began as a sharp confrontation between Chuck Schumer and Kash Patel evolved into something far more meaningful. It was never just about one exchange or one political win or loss. It was about what happens when truth, clarity, and persistence cut through noise. And in that, there are three lessons worth remembering. The first lesson is that integrity is non negotiable. Patel's calm approach showed that facts don't need theatrics to make an impact. When information is solid, it carries its own weight. The lesson here is simple but powerful. Integrity wins in the long run, even when the opposition is loud. For anyone watching, it was a reminder that honesty and preparation matter more than volume. The second lesson is that transparency builds trust. Part of Patel's effectiveness came from how clearly he presented evidence step by step so that anyone listening could follow. No jargon, no hidden meanings, just straightforward truth. That kind of transparency doesn't only win debates, it restores confidence. And confidence in leadership is something citizens crave in a system where trust is often in short supply. The third lesson is that accountability is everyone's responsibility. Patel made it clear that reform and oversight aren't only the job of politicians. Citizens must stay engaged, ask questions, and demand honesty. Without that pressure, the system remains vulnerable. This lesson turns the story back to the audience because the call for integrity cannot stop in one chamber or one moment. It has to live in the voices of people who expect better. And here's the real call to action. If you watch this unfold, if you felt the shift when truth outshined rhetoric, then the responsibility doesn't end when the video does. It continues in conversations and questions asked of leaders and in the standards people set for those in power. Every viewer has a role in making sure the lessons stick, not just as a story told, but as a standard carried forward. The beauty of this story is that it doesn't leave the audience in despair. Yes, the confrontation revealed flaws and weaknesses in the system, but it also revealed strength in clarity, strength in truth, and strength in reform. That balance is important because while scandals and conflicts can fuel frustration, solutions can fuel hope. Patel gave people both the exposure of what was wrong and a roadmap for what can be right. For the closing moment, the message is plain. This isn't about cheering one man's victory over another. It's about realizing that facts, integrity, and accountability can change the course of a debate and even the course of a system. And if that's possible in one exchange, it's possible anywhere citizens demand it. So here's the challenge for everyone watching. Don't just be an observer, be part of the accountability that ensures integrity isn't optional. Keep asking questions, keep demanding clarity, and keep remembering that transparency is the foundation of trust. Or, in Patel's own words, the truth doesn't need to shout, it just needs to stand.